Committee will please come to order. A quorum is present. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.J.Res 45, a Congressional Review Act resolution to overturn Biden's student loan bailout. The chair announces that requests for recorded votes as to amendments may be rolled pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 14B. Without objection, the committee may recess the committee at any point. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement. The committee is meeting today to discuss H.J.Res 45, a Congressional Review Act resolution to overturn Biden's student loan bailout. I thank Representative Bob Good for sponsoring this crucial resolution. If passed through both chambers, the joint resolution being debated today would nullify President Biden's radical plan to cancel up to $20,000 in student debt by executive fiat. For 2 years, President Biden has attempted to push a free college agenda through radical regulations, including income-driven repayment, executive actions like blanket cancellation, and his permanent pause on repayment. Student loan forgiveness is nothing more than a transfer of wealth from those who willingly took on debt to those who did not or had the grit to pay off their loans. Just 13% of Americans hold student loan debt, and over half is held by graduate students. In other words, President Biden is forcing the very people Democrats claim to care about, low-income families, disadvantaged populations, and blue-collar workers who never stepped foot on a college campus, to pay someone else's tuition bill. How much would it cost the American taxpayer? President Biden's student loan bailout alone will cost taxpayers an estimated $350 billion, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Coupled with his reckless income-driven repayment plan and other expansive regulations, his student loan scams would cost as much as $1 trillion. In fact, at a cost exceeding $3,500 per taxpayer, the president's income-driven repayment plan and mass cancellation represent the most expensive executive actions in American history, period. We have the chart here showing per taxpayer. These illegal actions also come at a time of rip-roaring inflation as Democrats' reckless spending sprees push our economy to the precipice of recession. The president's debt transfer plan alone could increase inflation by as much as 27 basis points, making it even harder for families to put food on the table and gas in their car. With our national debt quickly approaching $32 trillion, a bailout for graduate students and high-income households is the last thing we need on our nation's credit card. Our economy is a debt-fueled balloon waiting to pop, and this plan could be the proverbial needle. With all this spending, one would, at the very least, expect the broken student loan program to be repaired. Yet even if the president is able to move forward with his debt transfer plan, we'll be right back to $1.6 trillion in outstanding debt in less than 6 years. Why? Because colleges will increase their tuition and force students to borrow even more because they know taxpayers will foot the bill. The problems that plague post-secondary education cannot be solved by one-time debt jubilees. Solutions require hard work. Specifically, it means addressing the lack of accountability for the hundreds of billions of dollars that flow to colleges and universities that charge too much for degrees with little or no financial value, and reforming our student loan program, which Democrats are dead set on running into the ground. Without objection, I enter into the record an analysis by the National Taxpayers Union showing the cost per congressional district of members of this committee for Biden's student loan scam, and a letter from the Center for Education Policy noting that the Biden plan is regressive, inflationary, and ill-conceived. With that, I look forward to today's markup, and I urge passage of H.J.Res 45. Chair now yields to the distinguished ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Dr. Fox, and good morning. There are many challenges we have in higher education that demand our attention. For example, students and families face a student debt crisis thanks to the rising costs to attend college and the chronic state disinvestment in higher education. In fact, between 2008 and 2018, states spent on average 13% less per student after adjusting for inflation. The buying power of a Pell Grant has also fallen dramatically, from covering nearly 80% of the average cost of tuition, room, and board at a public four-year institution in 1975 to now less than about a third of that cost. Students continue to grapple with mental health problems and substance abuse challenges in colleges that we're not addressing, and a Republican-sponsored lawsuit against admissions policies at Harvard and University of North Carolina are threatening racial diversity at campuses nationwide. But instead of addressing those challenges, we're decided to take time with the proposal that already passed last month as part of the debt ceiling legislation. So let's be clear, this resolution to eliminate student debt would hurt millions of student borrowers and their families. 43 million student borrowers across the country are eligible for loan relief, including 139,000 in my district. Nearly 26 million borrowers in every congressional district applied for relief, including 16 million borrowers whose applications had already been approved before litigation started. More than 54,000 borrowers in my district have had their applications approved and sent to loan services before that was stopped by the litigation. H.J.Res 45 seeks to deny all of these borrowers relief that they were promised. More importantly, the people who would be impacted by most by this resolution are not the wealthy and well-connected. Under the president's plan, 90% of the relief would go to borrowers earning less than $75,000 a year. H.J.Res 45 would almost be possible to implement. Even if you don't like the student loan relief, it'd be impossible to implement because, first of all, you don't get to pick and choose in a Congressional Review Act. You don't get to pick and choose which parts of the rule you're overturning. You have to overturn the whole rule, one of which was the pause in payments. This would force people to begin their payments as if the rule had not passed. That's October in 2022. This thing would pass, everybody would instantaneously be about 8 months in arrears, and the interest pause would also, that interest would also be added back to their payments. This could trigger a wave of delinquencies and defaults to our most vulnerable borrowers. The interest would average about $233 per month for every month that back to October. Resolution prevents executive agencies from issuing similar, substantially the same rule as the disapproved rule. In other words, H.J.Res 45 blocks any future administrative action to support borrowers by pausing payments or interest accruing during future emergencies. Many of my colleagues on the other side have argued that we can't afford the plan, called it a giveaway. And that's just a matter of priorities, because congressional Republicans were willing to charge taxpayers $1.9 trillion for a tax package where 80% of the benefits were scheduled to go to the top 1% in corporations. But they're unwilling to invest half that amount to help student borrowers pay for their education. It'd be far better use of our time to focus on proposals that meaningfully support borrowers and make college more affordable. As you've mentioned, Madam Chair, we need to look forward, and we have introduced legislation such as the Loan Act, which lowers the cost of college by significantly increasing the Pell Grant and reducing the interest on the student loans as two of the major factors in that bill. So that would help students in the future. And the bottom line is that we have a responsibility to strengthen support for those seeking a college degree, not because everybody should be forced to get one, but for those who want a college degree they should have access to that opportunity. Anyone in this country who wants to take advantage of those benefits, not just the wealthy few, should be able to do so. Finally, when you talk about the cost in every district, I think we ought to look at that as the amount of relief in every district that will be denied if this resolution is finally adopted. This proposal does nothing to enhance college education, so I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose it and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. House rules require that a copy of the measure be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. Pursuant to the notice for today's meeting, a copy of the measure was made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. The joint resolution being marked up today shall be open to amendment at any point, and the chair will allow members to offer amendments in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Who seeks recognition on the resolution? Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. While I don't doubt the sincerity of my Democrat colleagues' belief that this is something that will help individuals who have gone to college, university to achieve what their dream is, yet I think what we're doing today actually benefits all more than anything we could do in simply paying off student loan debts. And so that's why I urge my colleagues to support H.J.Res 45, which would bar the President and Department of Education from moving forward with their illegal debt transfer scheme. Let's be truthful. This scheme will only increase inflation and do nothing to address the root causes of increasing college costs. There's a reason why, I believe, Republicans are now recognized as the party of the working man and woman. We recognize that this bartering for votes in giving student loan payoff schemes really goes to those that have the greatest ability, because the majority of that debt is for those that have gone on to graduate studies. Forcing those who did not go to college or those who sacrificed and saved to pay their way through school to pay for someone else's debt is not a fair deal. I remember the fact that my twin brother and I wanted to go to college. Our parents said, "That's great. Earn it." So we did. And it meant sacrificing, saving, and in certain cases with grad school, taking some additional time in order to be able to pay for our own student debt. I've heard from constituents all over my district who saved every penny that they could in order to pay off their loans. I've heard from parents who saved diligently so their sons and daughters had the opportunity to pursue higher education. The Biden administration's rule is a slap in the face to their hard work. We should be discussing ways to drive down the cost of college, making an education more affordable for all Americans. There's bipartisan consensus, I believe, that the cost of a college education is too expensive. However, President Biden's student loan scheme does nothing to address the root of this problem. And so I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, to make it clear that this is to end, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I believe, Mr. Sablon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before getting to my remarks, I'd like to remind my colleague who just spoke that 93,800 borrowers in his district would be denied relief if this resolution were enacted. Thank you. We're here today to discuss two emergencies, the student debt crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, which compounds the challenges already being faced by too many student loan borrowers and their families. The actions taken by both the previous and current administrations to pause student loan payments have served as a lifeline to millions of borrowers, including my constituents in the Northern Mariana Islands. In conversations and emails with a constituent who contacted me regarding who contacted me and just was discussing the daily routines, the daily rituals of life as a mother who had to come back and really get an education and start life again, struggles, but that there was one thing in her life that was a bright light. It was the student loan repayment pause and potentially the loan forgiveness. And the current and final pause actually has been extended until 60 days after the Supreme Court releases its decision regarding President Biden's student debt relief plan, or 60 days after June 30th if the litigation is unresolved. Despite the nearing end to this extension, the resolution we are discussing today would harshly roll back the latest payment pause, which was in effect from September through December of 2022. This rollback would unfairly force borrowers to pay back amounts they did not know they would be responsible for at this time under guidance from the federal government, as the payment pause affected payments, interest, and collections on defaulted loans. It takes time to rebuild after an emergency. This is a notion that seems to have been understood by both sides of the aisle, given that the student loan payment pause was extended twice under the Trump administration. The resolution would also impact students who have had their loans forgiven based on qualifying payments made during the pause. This is cruel. The individuals who have benefited from the student loan pause and those that would benefit greatly from President Biden's student loan debt relief plan, which would also be struck down by these resolutions, were struggling before the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 emergency moved the goalpost for student borrowers by further threatening their financial stability as a result of wage disruptions and additional expenses incurred due to the public health emergency, including related supply shortages and inflation. The committee held a hearing just this March, which highlighted the challenges facing student borrowers in light of the pandemic. The policies our Republican colleagues are discussing reversing today were put in place with the recognition that we're facing a serious student debt problem, one that is contributing to the inability of students to afford even basic needs after graduation and would have likely caused devastation for many had the COVID flexibilities not been in place. I urge my colleagues to oppose this harmful resolution. This measure would preempt the legal proceedings currently underway in the Supreme Court and, most importantly, cripple millions of individuals who deserve to be supported, not penalized in their pursuit of a quality education and subsequent gainful employment. And for the record, none of my statements were written by ChatGPT, but were actually, the contribution actually included a student with student loan debt. Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Ms. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Representative Good, for introducing this important resolution. I strongly oppose President Biden's proposal to force blue-collar workers in my district to pay off the student loans of borrowers who attended universities who are sitting on billion-dollar endowments. This plan is an attack on responsible Americans who chose to work hard and save money to pay for their education, and it's a slap in the face to the members of our military who are serving our country in uniform to earn tuition benefits. Higher education costs are skyrocketing because left-wing universities are hiring an army of DEI administrators. We must investigate and expose the massive increase in administrative costs that have nothing to do with providing students with a quality education that will lead to gainful employment. Universities that charge students six figures for humanities degrees in cultural Marxism should be on the hook when their graduates cannot get a job to repay the loan. This committee has requested detailed information from the Biden Department of Education so the American people can see what universities charge students for worthless degrees that fail to provide them with gainful employment so they can pay back the loans that they agreed to pay back. The department has refused to respond countless times and wants to keep taxpayers in the dark while sticking them with the bill. I urge my colleagues to stand up for taxpayers by opposing this latest Biden bailout, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I rise today in opposition to House Resolution 45, which will disapprove of waivers and modifications on borrowers' federal student loans. I got to tell you, I do know how difficult it is for young people to get an education and to be able to pay for it. Education is not cheap, and for some, it is out of reach. I have a grandson who'll be graduating from Howard this weekend, and fortunately, we were able to pay for him. But as a student myself, when I was in college, I too had to get student loans. But as a former educator, let me just say how ashamed I am and astonished to see my colleagues introduce divisive, misleading, and harmful resolutions. This partisan, all-Republican-led bill, which is punitive, in my opinion, if issued, would end the one-time debt relief and the December payment pause just when students need this relief. The Department of Education would also be prevented from issuing a similar ruling to the Biden administration's one-time debt relief and extension of payment pauses in the future. So let me be clear about this. This barely one-page bill does absolutely nothing to advance, to enrich, or uplift borrowers. Education is the pathway to the future for so many individuals. Under the Biden administration plan, 43 million borrowers would be eligible for student loan relief and 20 million would be eligible for future forgiveness of their loans. Ensuring that individuals affected by COVID and affected by other situations are not placed in a worse financial position. Within my own district, there are 121,000 estimated eligible borrowers under the Biden student loan relief debt relief plan, and 79,000, almost 80,000 of those borrowers were deemed automatically eligible for relief, which is about 65% of eligible borrowers, and 50,000 of those were fully approved applicants that were sent over to loan servicers for discharge, and that's about 42% of eligible borrowers in my district. I do want to remind colleagues and Ms. Miller, who spoke a moment ago, that more than 7,600 borrowers in his district would be denied relief if this resolution were enacted. So it's going to impact a lot of folks, including those who are pushing this resolution. Tens of thousands of constituents in my district will have the ability to live their lives without the looming effects of student loan debt. And just imagine the millions of borrowers that would be impacted as well. But unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle fail to realize the impact that would be made for so many Americans. I think we need to be sensitive about the issue, and while some folks can afford to pay and have done their best to pay, there are folks who need this help. But unfortunately, many of my colleagues fail to realize that this is going to be a tremendous impact, a positive impact on so many Americans. The legislation that they're pushing today moves to rid student aid borrowers in this country of an opportunity to better their financial situations and would improve the quality of their lives. A step forward, borrowers buying that house, for example, or taking that long trip, or starting the family that they wanted to start, starting the business that they wanted to start, and the list goes on. Education is an American right. It's a privilege, and no one should delay their life and livelihood going into debt for it. Some people go into retirement with this debt because of the interest that has accrued over the years. So I look forward to having a conversation with my colleagues that takes up these specific points, but I refuse to give credence to a conversation that will continue to put already at-risk borrowers in financial strain. I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution, and with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Congressman Williams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Benjamin Franklin noted that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. And similarly, the famous blues artist B.B. King notes that the beautiful thing about learning is that no one can take it away from you. And I myself have been the benefit of a lot of education, and I view education as an investment. And I'm very pleased with the investment that both I and my family have made, and its benefits. My wife and I both went to public high schools. We both attended liberal arts colleges. I received tremendous technical training in the Navy. It only cost me a little over 5 years of my life. The graduate degree that I pursued after the Navy also came at a high cost, but a graduate degree in business and operations also was a tremendous investment. And I just want to talk about this investment because given the extraordinary value of education, which I believe we all agree on, it seems to me that the Biden administration with this effort is acknowledging that perhaps these people that he wants to provide relief for didn't receive an education at all, that they received no value. That's a great mystery to me. You know, perhaps these families and students were defrauded. Maybe they were defrauded out of their money, and that's why the government should come in for this relief. So I ask the President, is this true? Is this true that there was no value received? Because we know that education is a great investment. I know it in my own life, and I believe that that's universally believed. So perhaps we should be investigating whether these families and students were defrauded instead of just a blanket forgiveness of debt. So my question is, forgiving this debt is either an admission of failure of our higher education system, or it's a tremendous transfer of wealth from the working Americans onto a select handful. I support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Ms. Jayapal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Before getting to my remarks, I'd like to remind my colleague, Mr. Williams, who just spoke, that 115,400 borrowers in his district would be denied relief if this resolution were enacted. I strongly oppose this cruel, extreme, unworkable resolution that would recklessly reverse the student payment pause for nearly 43 million borrowers and would block student debt cancellation for over 40 million Americans, most of whom are low and middle income borrowers. Even President Trump acknowledged the burden of student debt and the threat that the economic fallout of the pandemic would have on borrowers when he waived loan interest and let borrowers pause payments using his legal authority. He then signed into law the Bipartisan CARES Act, which paused these payments. He then later extended the pause on student loan payments again using his legal authority. President Biden has continued this pause under the same authority and also recognize that disadvantaged communities pursuing a pathway to the middle class should not be trapped in a lifetime of debt. That is why the Biden administration proposed canceling up to $20,000 in student loan debt per borrower receiving Pell and $10,000 for other borrowers from working families. But this dangerous resolution threatens that transformative relief. Over 40 million borrowers will be eligible for cancellation, and half of those borrowers are represented by Republican members of Congress. This resolution would cruelly send nearly 44 million surprise loan bills to borrowers by abruptly ending the pause, which has saved borrowers an average in these very difficult times of about $233 per month and has helped boost credit scores for 30 million people by an average of 30 points. I just want to share some direct quotes on what this has meant to my constituents. My family has less debt and is closer to freedom. It doesn't affect me, but I'm so glad that it's there for those who need it.
Besides.
Not living paycheck to paycheck, not worrying about feeding my family. This is what constituents across America are saying. The pause has made some progress towards the promise of economic mobility. But this bill would force millions of Americans who are saving an average of $233 a month from the pause to pay the government for 4 months of retroactive payments plus interest. That's nearly $1,000. That is absurd. Instead of guaranteeing a pathway to prosperity without crushing student debt, this Republican bill would guarantee borrowers struggle by retroactively ending the payment pause and blocking debt relief. The majority claims to be the party of fiscal responsibility, but they're advancing a resolution that would send millions of surprise loan bills to the borrowers that they represent. They choose to prioritize the wealthy. $757 billion in PPP loans were forgiven. Half of those loans went to the top 20% richest incomes in the first year, and the majority said nothing. 2 members of this committee totaled $7.5 million in PPP forgiveness, and who can forget the $1.5 trillion worth of corporate tax handouts in 2017 that working families are still paying for. So don't fall for the GOP myth that this cancellation helps the wealthiest. In fact, 90% of these relief dollars for student debt cancellation go to those who are earning less than $75,000 a year. And no one earning more than $125,000, no individual, will receive relief. The majority says they're the party of fairness and lawfulness, but they want to reverse the public service loan forgiveness for otherwise eligible public servants in their own districts. Who is that? Law enforcement, service members, first responders, others who are part of the 615,000 public servants that played and paid by the rules under the pause. They do not deserve this cruel, extreme, unworkable proposal. If the majority were concerned about rural Americans, they never would have put this resolution on the table, because rural Americans owe an average of $35,000 in student debt, and 1 in 6 have fallen into delinquency or default, above the national average of 1 in 7. If they were concerned for those who skip college to avoid student loan debt, they would have supported meaningful reforms to our higher ed system, like College for All, which would end disinvestment in college access and give people a path to debt-free college. We tell our kids to pursue higher education as a tool for economic and social mobility, but college isn't affordable anymore, and the enduring weight of student debt prevents many borrowers from accessing opportunities to truly transform their lives and their country. I urge my colleagues to block this resolution. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Grossman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This is just one more step by the Biden administration to weaken America in so many different ways. The obvious way we've talked about today is it further robs Congress of the power of the purse, creates another precedent that that we really have a dictator as president, doesn't have to worry about Congress. But there are other things here as well. It encourages irresponsibility. We penalize those people who prepay loans as opposed to those who aren't paying their loans off at all. It continues down the path of not addressing the underlying problem in this country, which is the cost of college education is too great at a time where colleges all around the country are hiring diversity coordinators, an obvious place to cut. We're saying, well, it doesn't matter because you're still going to have a high enrollment because we're going to hand out student loans to people, and those people more and more over time are going to begin to expect that those student loans can be forgiven. It further drives the country in debt. There are estimates that suggest that this student loan forgiveness plan will eventually cost over $1 trillion. We're already at $31 trillion of debt. We already have inflation out of control. The whole country, and I think the financial markets, are looking to see whether the United States is ever going to get their financial house in order. This loan forgiveness just screams, no, the United States is still governed by a bunch of people you'd expect to be governing a banana republic in which we think nothing of apparently putting another $1 trillion on the books. So I will emphasize, I think this forgiveness is illegal. It is unconstitutional. It further sends the message to future Americans that the idea of paying off your own loans is foolish because ultimately the government will step in and pay off those loans for you. And therefore, I'm glad we have H.J.Res 45 before us today. I'd like to thank the chair for advancing it, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Well, I thank you very much for yielding. I want to respond to some confusion that my Democrat colleagues appear to be having about what H.J.Res does and does not do. Unfortunately, radical advocacy groups whose sole mission is to see every last student loan transferred to taxpayers have put out untruthful claims about this legislation to scare student loan borrowers. With zero evidence of historical precedent to rely upon, these left-wing advocates are misleading borrowers by, among other things, telling them that they will have to make payments retroactively for the time student loan payment was paused. That's just not true. My Democrat colleagues are unfortunately amplifying this deceitful claim. However, I want to be clear. Nothing in this bill requires the Department of Education to break down the doors of borrowers like Biden's IRS army and force borrowers to make retroactive payments. And nothing in this bill directs the department to take away the months spent in forbearance that count towards programs like public service loan forgiveness. This administration's been using its bully pulpit to sell a bill of goods to borrowers while knowing it has no legislative authority on which to base its promises. And the clock was reset, but I know there was only about 2 minutes left, and so I'm going to stop my comments there and to honor the time that was allocated to me, and I yield back. Ms. Wilson, I believe you're next. You're recognized for 5 minutes. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
I said you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to remind my colleague who just spoke that 76,800 borrowers in his district would be denied relief if this resolution were enacted in Wisconsin. I'm sure he doesn't want that to happen. Please help me understand what is wrong with this Congress. I have served on this education committee for more than 10 years, and out of the clear blue, Republicans are attacking public education and are anti-teacher, anti-college, anti-education, and anti-student. They're attacking our children, our schools with no shame. Why? What happened? Who drank the Kool-Aid? Not my education committee. Somebody help me wrap my hands around this. We all know that a college degree is the surest way to economic mobility for Democrats and Republicans. My parents paid for my college monthly like a mortgage, no loans. As the economy slowed and college costs rose, we ushered in college loans for some. And in 1973, because of the loans were overwhelming, the Pell Grant was born. But the Pell Grant could not keep up with the cost of college. Through the years, the student debt crisis grew. Now the crisis has turned into a life-altering catastrophe that is about to cancel lives and must be addressed and rectified now. I personally know people in their 50s and 60s still paying for their student debt. In some instances, the principal amount owed has not changed. There are families who are on the brink of disaster because of the toll the parent plus loans took. Many have lost their homes. The cost of college keeps rising out of control. So President Biden said he raised student loans up to $20,000 for some and $10,000 for most, and the Republicans are whining. But why? We bailed out the airlines. We bailed out the automobile industry, especially in Detroit. General Motors became known as Government Motors. State governments balanced their budget because of federal money from the pandemic. Local governments got tons of money. Members of Congress and their families got their PP loans forgiven, and Republicans never said a word. A little bad press here and there, but that was it. When we decided to bail out the students, the hard-working, want-to-be somebody college graduates who contribute to the economy, all hell breaks loose, and the whining turns to outrage. A 2024 twice-impeached Republican candidate for president filed for bankruptcy at least 5 times and had his loans forgiven by our government, millions and millions of dollars, but not the students. Where were you when we bailed out the airlines, the automobiles, local governments, your industry Republican colleagues, and the billionaire farmers who we bail out every year, the family members of Congress? When Republicans controlled both chambers and the White House in 2017, they gave billionaires $1.7 trillion in tax breaks. But today, they've come here to lecture this committee on the implications of giving everyday Americans money for student loan debt forgiveness. This is a double standard. I've asked my staff to research every member of the House and Senate who ever filed for any loan forgiveness, any bankruptcy, and I'm going to publish that report if this resolution comes to the floor. Let us help our children and the hardworking people who are making a difference, who deserve our support, who will help our economy, and our economy will prosper. This is the Education Committee. We should be advocating for our children and our students, no matter what. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Mr. Bean, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning to you, and good morning, Education Committee. Madam Chair, I want you and America to know that not everybody has gone off the deep end. The only word I can describe this plan is nuts. It's nuts. It's nuts because it's not fair. 2/3 of Americans don't go to college. Why should they subsidize the third that does? And of the third that does, the vast majority pays back their loans or has worked through college to make sure that they have paid their own way. What do you tell my son or others that have joined the military? That's what my son did, joined the military to make sure that he could go through college without encouraged debt. It also makes things worse. It makes things worse. We do this. It makes inflation much worse. Everybody's struggling with trying to keep up with inflation, but it also makes our current university system worse, that it incentivizes our universities to continually focus on degrees that don't provide the return that you would think getting a college degree would give you. And finally, Madam Chair, it's nuts because America can't afford it. I got some breaking news that maybe some people on this committee don't know, and that is we're $33 trillion in debt, struggling to come to an agreement right now on how we're going to address that debt. So the numbers, we still can't clarify exactly what this cost. It's sort of like walking into a store and seeing something you want, but there's no price tag on it. How do you know how much it costs? So whatever it is it costs, would it be better to put that money somewhere else? I can't imagine that this is what we would all agree on, just to give away billions of dollars. So, Madam Chair, I say yes to this resolution that brings sense and sensibility to how we can improve America's education system. Say yes to the resolution and no to Biden's student debt debacle. Madam Chair, I yield back the rest of the time.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And before getting into my remarks, I'd like to remind my colleague, Mr. Bean from Florida, who just spoke, that far from being nuts, there are 119,300 borrowers in his district who would be denied relief if this resolution were enacted. And also, Madam Chair, I'd like to respond to claims that you made by the chairwoman that if enacted, H.J.Res 45 would not retroactively affect payments that were paused from September to December of 2022. But I quote from a CRS report on congressional statements of disapproval under the CRA, quote, if a joint resolution of disapproval is submitted within the CRA specified deadline passed by Congress and signed by the President, the CRA states that the disapproved rule shall not take effect or continue. The rule would be deemed not to have had any effect at any time. Even provisions that had become effective would be retroactively negated. So it does, in fact, create the chaos of retroactive effect. So, Madam Chair, I strongly oppose this resolution. I've advocated for years for needed changes to the student loan system. That was true before the pandemic, but especially important in the aftermath, which brought sudden economic uncertainty to millions of borrowers. In fact, this student debt relief plan will help about 43 million Americans. More than a third of those, I note, are more than 40 years old. And I also want to align myself with the comments made by my colleagues that this Congress has bailed out industries. They've forgiven loan debt throughout the pandemic with PPP. As a parent, as a school volunteer for years, as an advocate for students, and as a policymaker, I know education is the best investment we can make to give everyone the opportunity to be successful in school and in life. There are many important issues in higher education we should be talking about instead of this resolution we're marking up. They're genuine issues of unaffordability. I'll note that the cost of higher education has almost tripled since I went to college and law school, and we need to reasonably and helpfully address that growing debt burden, particularly affecting borrowers of color. There's a lot we could and should be doing. We could crack down on predatory for-profit institutions that aggressively target low-income students and then overcharge and overpromise. I submit that we would benefit from discussing the decline of humanities, which is especially concerning at this time in our country when we desperately need more empathy and more ethics. We should also be working together to increase access to affordable, high-quality opportunities to get a higher education. We could be making needed reforms to the federal work-study program. We could be increasing Pell Grants and providing more flexibility. At the very least, let's allow students to refinance their loan balances at low interest rates. We could be marking up my bipartisan streamlining income-driven manageable payments on loans for education or Simple Act that will help prevent student loan defaults by automatically enrolling struggling borrowers in income-driven repayment plans so they can repay based on financial ability. There's a lot we can be doing to make higher education more affordable and accessible, but instead, the bill we're marking up today will hurt borrowers who desperately need relief. That's disappointing, and not just for me, but for the millions of Americans who are being held back by student loan debt. I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. I recognize now the sponsor of the resolution, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
On Monday, President Biden's secretary said If you buy a car, you're expected to make the monthly payments. If you buy a home, you're expected to pay the mortgage every month. That is the expectation. And I agree, and I'm sure that most of my colleagues do, and we should apply that same logic to the issue at hand today. If you take a loan from the taxpayers of America to go to college, as I did, as my children have done, you are expected to pay it back, as I did and as my children are doing. President Biden doesn't understand this common sense issue. He has wielded his executive power to inflict more financial harm on the American taxpayer through this $315 billion student loan transfer scheme. And that is transfer scheme in terms of transferring the debt to the taxpayers who did not incur the debt. 60% of the constituents in my district don't have a college degree. Yet the Biden administration wants them to pay for the education of others who are projected to earn more money than those who did not get the college degree. I'm proud to be the sponsor of this resolution of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act to hold President Biden accountable for his reckless, unfair, unlawful, unconstitutional student loan proposal. Simply put, President Biden does not have the authority to transfer student loan debt to the taxpayers and to unilaterally spend $315 billion without an act of Congress. His plan to make college free was not able to pass Congress even when the Democrats had total control of both houses and the White House. So he has unilaterally tried to act by executive decree. That is not America. That is not our constitutional republic. Federal involvement in higher education has done nothing to bring down the cost of college. In fact, for every dollar increase in student loan subsidies, colleges simply increase their tuition by 60 cents. Across the country, more than 92% of all student loan debt comes from federal loans totaling over $1.6 trillion. And this debt is held by just 13% of the population. The federal government is creating a culture of irresponsibility and dependency in this next generation. And the federal government's pause of student loan payments has already cost hardworking Americans an estimated $195 billion just over the last 3 years. I encourage everyone to support this resolution. The student loan transfer scheme doesn't make the debt go away. It shifts the cost from borrowers and transfers it to hardworking American taxpayers. Congress must act to stop the unilateral and unconstitutional actions of President Biden that are exacerbating the higher education financial crisis. So I thank the committee and the chairman for holding this markup, and I urge my colleagues on both sides to vote in favor of this resolution and support this common sense legislation. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Good. Ms. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I urge my colleagues, did you say Hayes? To not support this resolution. We've heard a lot about fairness on this committee, about radical regulation and what this does, and the number of people who did not take out student loans and will not benefit from this. I do not own a small business, yet I supported payroll protection because I recognized that that was good for our communities. In 2008, when we bailed out the banks, I did not own stock in any corporation, and I was a taxpayer and recognized that that was something that we needed to do to support our American economy. Similarly, when we bailed out the housing industry, I did not own a home, but as an American taxpayer, my tax dollars went to supporting those who did because I recognized that that's what we do as a country. Members of this Congress and of this committee have benefited from bailouts as recently as last year and bankruptcy protection for years, for generations, and no one has said boo about those things. But when it comes to supporting young people who are just trying to have a chance to make a life for themselves, that's where we draw the line. 38.6 million borrowers will benefit from student loan forgiveness. 90% of those dollars will go to students, to people making less than $75,000 annually. We have bailed out CEOs from the wealthiest corporations who attended Ivy League institutions, yet we draw the line at 18-year-olds trying to get a fighting chance. There's something clearly wrong with that. We also heard about useless degrees. We are at a time where we have a shortage of frontline workers, teachers, nurses, social workers, engineers, all of the public servants in our community have jobs that require higher education. College is being framed as a luxury. In many instances, it's a necessity. These are the people who we need in our communities. And those essential workers should also come from the hardest hit communities. We should not have to import people into our communities that come from families that can afford to go to college. This is deeply personal to me. I'm a teacher. I went to college to become a teacher. I took out student loans. So the debt that I acquired through student loans was not to become a member of Congress. It was to become a teacher and teach in the community where I grew up and I lived, a Title I, low-income, underperforming community. I felt that I could be of service to that community. And there are so many young people who feel exactly the same way. But this isn't just about young people. We have senior citizens and elderly individuals who live on Social Security who are still paying back student loans. 1/3 of the people over the age of 40. So we are not having a real conversation about how we address debt and deficit in this country. No mention of taxing the wealthiest Americans. But $10,000 in student loan forgiveness is going to break the backs of hardworking Americans. I remind people that the people who take out these loans are also hardworking Americans. They're also taxpayers. They also pay into the system that other people benefit on their dollar. So that's what a functioning democracy is about. It's not just what affects you. There are times, like I mentioned at the beginning of my statement, where I had to pay into programs that did not affect me at all. Housing bailout, the financial crisis bailout, payroll protection, so many things. But then there are other times where we shift our resources to the people who need it most. And we are at a time where we're talking about a shortage in the pipeline of essential workers in these key industries and fields that require higher education. And then there was talk about graduate degrees. I think the members of this committee need to familiarize themselves with how most of these jobs work. As a teacher, I was required to have a master's degree within 5 years of landing my first job in education. So it's not a luxury to attain higher education. In most jobs, it's a basic minimum requirement. I would think that the Committee on Education and Workforce would have some vested interest in preserving education for millions of Americans who benefit from it, and providing options for the people who do not want to go to college. College is not our only option, and I've said that many times on this committee, but it seems like every time we gavel in, it is another attempt to dismantle education in this country. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this dangerous resolution, and if we really want to have a conversation about debt and deficits, let's start with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. With that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I believe I just heard Chairman Fox state that H.J.Res 45 will not retroactively require borrowers to repay loan payments that were forgiven during the pandemic pause, a forgiveness first implemented by the prior president and extended twice by the prior president, and then extended again by President Biden as the pandemic emergency continued. If indeed Republicans who drafted this resolution have no intention to claw back loan forgiveness from the 1,074,824 North Carolina borrowers who are just doing all they can to pay their bills, raise their families, get the education they need to fill those good jobs that are going unfilled in my district, then I suggest that the chairman withdraw H.J.Res 45 and redraft it in a way that clarifies and reflects the statement she just made in this markup. I also suggest that this committee could better use its time by getting to work on finding ways that we can make education more affordable, by increasing funding for apprenticeship programs and technical training programs so students who don't go to college can pursue and obtain the post-secondary education they need to fill those good jobs out there today. We could also make sure that public service loan programs actually works for the public servants who do everything they can to work in the public sector and make those payments for 10 years. And I'm talking about teachers and nurses and doctors who thought they would have their loans forgiven. And then after 10 years of hard work and loan payments, they discovered that there were complicated rules they didn't even know about that prevented their loans from being forgiven. The Biden administration put a fix in place for the pandemic period, but that fix was a temporary emergency fix. So this committee could be working to make that fix permanent. And this committee could be working to make the cost of college more affordable by increasing Pell Grants in a meaningful way. When Pell Grants were established, the goal was to put college within reach of families who had no money for college. In 1978, a student attending a public four-year university would have had about 70 to 80% of their costs covered by Pell Grants. Today, that figure sits at around 20 to 30%. Pell Grants are a lifeline for low-income students. An estimated 97% of Pell Grant recipients had a total family income of at or below $60,000 in the academic year 20 to 21. Students of color are also more likely to be Pell Grant recipients, and I have wonderful colleges in my district where the vast majority of students are Pell Grant recipients. It is unacceptable that a college education is now unaffordable for so many Americans that have found themselves drowning in debt. But it is also unacceptable that the Pell Grant program, which has helped so many students get the education they need, has become so devalued. So Congress could be doing, and this Education Committee could be doing what they need to do to make college more affordable for students, rather than clawing back loan forgiveness as this H.J.Res 45 is doing. So I urge my colleagues to vote no, and with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Ms. Omar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
It is no secret that student loan debt has become an overwhelming burden on millions of Americans, preventing them from achieving their dreams, hindering their ability to contribute to our economy. I am so disappointed to see the efforts from my Republican colleagues to use the CRA to attack millions of workers and families with student debt. If you can get past the shock of how cruel this is and ask why, you will see the answer is to simply score political points and nothing more. Some of my colleagues on the other side are fine with accepting millions of dollars in PPP loan forgiveness for themselves and are always ready to bail out corporations, but draw the line at providing financial relief to individuals struggling with student loan debt. They also like to falsely claim that student debt relief will merely pay off the debt of the elite. But the truth is, President Biden's debt relief program was designed to provide much-needed relief to most economically vulnerable borrowers, with more than 90% of student debt relief going to borrowers earning below $75,000 per year. That includes more than 75,000 constituents in Chairwoman Fox's district who are eligible for student debt relief, 77,000 constituents in Chair Owen's district, and almost 97,000 constituents in Representative Stefanik's district, and over 40 million eligible constituents across the country that would benefit from debt relief, half of which have already been fully approved for discharge but are in limbo because of politically motivated efforts by the Republicans. Since the beginning of the payment pause, which began under the Trump administration and has had bipartisan congressional support up until recently, millions of borrowers have been able to use the monthly savings to keep food on the table and roof over their heads during the pandemic. But perhaps the cruelest piece of this proposal is the one that would retroactively overturn the 7th payment pause. This would not only force borrowers back into repayment, but resulting in thousands of dollars in payments and accumulated interest added back onto their balances. The cruelty is the point. The reality is that payment pause has been critical economic lifeline for tens of millions of borrowers. Public service workers have been able to accrue credit towards forgiveness under PSLF. This proposal will also claw back progress made and reinstate loans that have been canceled over this time frame. These are the same nurses, educators, service members, and hundreds of thousands of other public service workers across the country who have been called our heroes over the course of this pandemic. This is how my Republican colleagues want to pay them back. The fact is that student loan borrowers and their families should not be used as a political pawn. Congress should be acting to improve the circumstances of the American people, not attempting to thwart the president's efforts. Let us stand up for the tens of thousands of federal student loan borrowers and their families who would be affected by student debt. Vote no on this resolution. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a couple of points, and one has been made a couple of times. I just want to emphasize the effect of the Congressional Review Act is, if it passes, the entire rule is stricken as if it had never been issued. Now, you can't line item under the CRA. You have to knock out the whole rule. The whole rule included pause in payments and pause in interest. So if the rule is knocked out, there's no pause starting October 2022. And so people will be months in arrears, and the interest, which has not accrued, will be reinstated. That's the obvious effect of the Congressional Review Act. The second point I want to make is remind us why we're here. We're here because students have had to incur massive debt because of disinvestment on the part of the government. Several decades ago, the Pell Grant covered 80% of the cost of going to a state college, tuition, room, and board, 80%. They had to come up with 20%. Now that the Pell Grant covers only a third, all of the rest of that cost is on the student. States used to pay 2/3 of the cost of the state college. Now it's less than 1/3 on average. All of that has occurred, has meant that students have had to incur debt to achieve a college education. This little relief, $10,000 or $20,000 if you'd received a Pell Grant, goes to cover a lot of people. It's somewhere in the order of magnitude of half of the students with student debt will have their entire debt wiped out. That means they no longer have to delay buying a house, starting a family because of this overwhelming, crushing debt. And we've had a lot of concern expressed. We didn't hear any concern about equity when the $1.9 trillion Trump tax cut passed, when 80% of the benefits went to the top 1% in corporations. There was no talk about equity and would transfer of wealth and things like that. There's no concern about paying back loans when wealthy businessmen got PPP loans. Members of Congress, some members of Congress got PPP loans in the range of $1 million. I didn't hear them complaining that they didn't have to pay it back. Those were forgiven. There's no concern about the requirement of paying back loans when you take them. There's no concern about running up the national debt. I think it's important to remind people that every Republican president since Nixon, the administration has left for the succeeding Democrats a worse deficit situation than they inherited. Every Republican administration since Nixon, without exception. Every Democratic administration since Kennedy has left for their Republican successors a better deficit situation than they inherited. President Trump was on the way to fulfilling that trend before the pandemic, and President Biden has already started chipping away at the deficit. So this student debt relief is a small step in the right direction. It helps a lot of people, and I think it's as equitable as we can get. But as we have heard, we need to look to the future in other legislation. The Loan Act significantly increases the Pell Grant so that students don't have to take out as much student loan and don't have to pay as much interest when they do take out those loans. That's something we can work on for the future. But for now, this Congressional Review Act is a step in the wrong direction. I hope it will be defeated. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I yield myself 5 minutes. There's some things that I want to talk about in terms of what we're taking away, but before that, I want to respond a little bit to what the ranking member has said. You know, before the Pell Grant, people paid for their own education. Before the government got involved, people paid for their own education. It's always about what the government isn't doing as opposed to what is the individual responsibility in this country. And I have to say that I think turning our culture on its head as though it's up to the government to pay for everything is just insane. We used to have a culture where people felt they had their own responsibility. And by the way, the 10th Amendment says that if it isn't outlined for the federal government to do, it's left to the states and the individuals. And the federal government isn't assigned a duty to take care of education. It's not in the Constitution. So I just want to say I think our colleagues try to turn on its head the culture in this country and going from where individuals take care of themselves and to a place where the government's supposed to take care of everything. Now let me say my colleagues have made a lot of hay over what Republicans are supposedly taking away. Well, I'd like to highlight that the majority, 53.8% to be precise, of Americans in Democrat districts don't have a college degree. Additionally, of those members, 3.3 million have never stepped foot on a college campus. The majority of Americans' Democrat districts will have to pay for this program. Those 53% will have to pay almost $26 billion for those who had the privilege to go to college. And to what end? If this Biden debt scheme went into effect, we would be back here in less than 6 years because this administration isn't doing anything to actually fix the root problems, which is the high cost of going to college. 2/3 of Biden's debt transfer plan would go to the top half of earners. Among federal student borrowers leaving school in 2024, 70% of debt will be owed by students who went to graduate school, and 39% of the total will be owed by graduate students expected to earn more than $100,000 annually during their careers. Let me be perfectly clear. Republicans support individuals pursuing post-secondary education if that's what they want to do. But colleges have not been held accountable for far too long. The solution to the challenges facing our system aren't to just forgive debt, but rather to crack down on the system to ensure students aren't being taken advantage of and tuition costs going up higher than the rate of inflation. I will now recognize Mr. Takano for 5 minutes.
I yield to the ranking member for 30 seconds.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just wanted to quote President Johnson when he signed the Higher Education Act. He said it means that a high school senior anywhere in this great land of ours can apply to any college or any university in any of the 50 states and not be turned away because his family is poor. That's our responsibility to our nation. Thank you.
I think the ranking member, reclaiming my time, Madam Chair, I move to strike last word and would like to rise in opposition to this joint resolution. I would have hoped this committee would be pursuing action pertinent to helping student borrowers and seeking to support improvements for the federal student loan program rather than to dismantle any improvements. If implemented, this joint resolution would effectively prohibit the Biden administration from implementing their one-time student debt relief plan. It is imperative to note this is a one-time relief plan, not a revolving door of relief. And despite what the Republicans of this committee will loudly claim, the one-time relief is not a bailout. This is a lifeline. And I would implore the Republicans on this committee to speak with borrowers in their own districts about this very issue, as college debt has become and has been weighing on borrowers in all stretches of this country. The administration has taken historic action in light of extraordinary circumstances to help borrowers receive some much needed relief. The president's targeted student debt cancellation plan would provide breathing room for more than 40 million Americans. Let me repeat, 40 million Americans. In my district, in California alone, an estimated number of 95,000 borrowers would be eligible for student debt relief. And at this juncture, 56,000 borrowers have applied or were deemed automatically eligible for relief in the 39th Congressional District, my district. These numbers are not just statistics. These are real-life Americans that are yearning for some support. There are borrowers that have been saddled with crushing debt for years as their student loan payments have prevented them from purchasing homes, having children, saving for retirement, and being able to have some financial freedom. The second portion of this resolution gears attention towards the payment pause. Let us remember this simple fact. The Trump administration was the first to place the payment pause into effect. The first pause was placed into effect during March 2020, during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the pandemic relentlessly dragged on, multiple payment pauses were enacted during both the previous administration and the Biden presidency. This joint resolution would roll back the payment pause for the months of September through December 2022. This would only cause further confusion for borrowers. I find the notion of this committee action today disheartening. As we wait to hear the final say from the Supreme Court ruling, we should be taking steps to help both current and future borrowers. And I would like to stress that before the courts put the debt relief program on pause, 26 million borrowers had either applied for or were automatically eligible for debt relief. The ruling in June will determine the fate of millions of borrowers. The rising costs of tuition are a significant concern, and as members of the House Education and Workforce Committee, we should be looking for ways to help borrowers minimize the amount of debt graduates are left to repay. It appears to me that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are intent on leaving borrowers in disarray rather than helping them. Student debt is crushing our borrowers, and I commend the Biden administration for taking historic action. I urge my colleagues to avoid this harmful resolution. And let me say that I would join the chairwoman in an effort to hold educational institutions and states across this country in terms of reining in the costs of higher education. But let us remember that state support of education, the state's support has diminished over the last several decades, pushing more and more of the costs onto families and making them borrow. But might I add that we need to do far more to rein in the abuses of the for-profit college industry, and I would hope the chairwoman would join me in that effort. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Moran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Nearly 30 years ago, I began my post-secondary education studies. Though my parents supported my educational pursuits in many ways, they were not able to do so financially. So that financial burden was one that I largely bore on my own. Better stated, it was a financial investment that I chose to make in my future. To pay for much of my college education, I took on a variety of jobs. I did things like working as a server, running vending routes, serving as a painter's helper, refereeing intramural sports, roofing houses in the hot Texas summer sun, and even working as a teaching assistant at a junior high school. Despite my hard work, though, a shortfall did exist between what my college education cost and what I could earn during those times of work. I made up that shortfall by taking out federal student loans, something I was willing to do because I had counted the costs and the benefits of making that decision on the front side. I knew that it was my individual responsibility to fully repay those loans because I understood that I would be the beneficiary of this decision and this investment in my future. While in the process of taking out these loans, I thoroughly vetted my options and determined which would be most beneficial for my academic journey. I figured out just how much these loans were going to cost me and how long I could expect to pay them off for. And it did. It took me years, but I was willing to do that and always happy that I made that investment. In short, when I took out these loans, I fully understood the financial obligations associated with them, and I willingly accepted those obligations because I knew the long-term benefits for me and my family. As the father of 4 school-aged children, including 2 who are preparing the next step in their journey past high school, it's important that my children understand the options and that they weigh the costs and the benefits, and together we make a decision about what cost and what benefit and what avenue to pursue. I do not expect other families to bear the burdens of the decision that me and my kids are making together, a decision that will certainly benefit them. Unfortunately, this difficult conversation is not one that many families are having or that enough families are having. As a result of this, many first-time students are enrolling in student loan programs not fully understanding the financial responsibilities associated with pursuing higher education, and this has left thousands of students earning degrees that they cannot pay for down the road. Just a couple of days ago, Press Secretary Jean-Pierre said, quote, "If you buy a car, you are expected to pay the monthly payments. If you buy a home, you are expected to pay the mortgage every month. That is the expectation," unquote. For once, I can say that I agree with her. Applying the same principle here, if you take out student loans, you are expected to pay for those student loans, not other people. The student loan forgiveness program proposed by this administration is both unfair and unconstitutional. It's contrary to free market economics. It incentivizes students to take out way more than they need and way more than they can pay back, and it incentivizes colleges and universities to redirect potential funds away from merit-based scholarships to other non-essential expenditures, because everybody knows that the assumption is those loans will get paid off by the government, and neither the students nor the universities have to worry about it. Approximately 92% of all student loan debt in the United States is held by 13% of the population, with the majority of this debt being owned by individuals seeking a graduate or professional degree after obtaining their 4-year degree, something that I did. In East Texas, in my district, nearly 70% of the adults do not have college degrees. The president, by this initiative, is asking these individuals to bear the burdens of those who chose to pursue a college education and to incur the debt associated with it. Despite a majority of my district choosing not to pursue a higher education, this student loan bailout is expected to cost my folks in the 1st Congressional District of Texas over $1.15 billion. When divided by the roughly 770,000 East Texans, that's almost $1,500 per person. It's not the responsibility of my constituents or any taxpaying American to subsidize the loans of those individuals who accept the terms of the loans, who accept the responsibilities associated with them, and also directly benefit from the education funded by the loans. This proposed student bailout is just another example of poor policies from the administration that's going to drive up inflation. It's another tax on the American people that they cannot bear. I concur with the joint resolution sponsored by Mr. Good to revoke the administration's authority and ability to cancel student loans, and I think this is a critical joint resolution for us to pass. No individual should have the authority to single-handedly force hardworking Americans to pay for $400 billion of student loan debt that they do not own. East Texans should not be on the line for other people's loan debt. Hardworking taxpayers should not be on the line for other people's debts. Our own decisions both cost and benefit us both, and we should bear those decisions on our own. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I'd like to yield my time to my colleague, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. Just a few questions for my friends on the other side of the aisle. What is the constitutional justification for the federal government, or actually by extension hardworking taxpayers, to fund college or graduate level education for Americans? What is the basis for suggesting that the federal government, or actually the taxpayer, federal government doesn't have any money, it only forces the confiscation of resources from hardworking taxpayers, or borrows beyond what it confiscates from the taxpayers. So what's the justification for doing that? To provide education for citizens. Do taxpayers also have a responsibility to fund PhDs or terminal degrees? What is the limit? Why, again, would we force non-borrowing taxpayers to pay other people's student loans? With our national debt being what it is, the big issue of the day, the debt ceiling situation, why would we borrow, not spend, we don't even have the money, why would we borrow more money since we're running deficits currently of about $100 billion a month? The federal government is literally already spending about $100 billion a month more than it takes in. Why would we borrow more to cover the cost of transferring student loan debt to those who didn't borrow it? But furthermore, why would we keep on making student loans if we're not going to require the borrowers to repay them? Is there any limit to what the government should do, or better said, force hardworking taxpayers to do, to provide for the citizens, or actually to saddle them with more debt? The Biden student loan transfer scheme would simply transfer the debt owed by college-educated, higher-earning borrowers and pile it onto the $32 trillion national debt owed by all Americans at an average of nearly $100,000 per citizen. So we're saying those who've borrowed for their education, those who now have the propensity to earn a higher income, ought to be able to transfer that debt to the average citizen who owes about $100,000 in national debt. So I am thankful to this committee that we are finally taking action to try to rectify this unjust and injurious action by this administration. And I yield back to Mr. Owens.
Thank you. Now you're back.
Back. The committee will now proceed to consideration of the resolution H.J.Res 45 for amendment. The resolution was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
H.J.Res 45, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 under United States Code of the rules submitted by the Department of Education relating to waivers and modifications of federal student loans.
Without objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with. Without objection, the resolution will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The question now occurs on the H.J.Res 45. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed?
No.
No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the resolution is agreed to.
Yes, for recorded vote.
The
Yeah, you want to do on the motion to report here.
Could the chair restate the last motion under parliamentary inquiry?
The question now occurs on the H.J.Res 45. All in favor say aye.
Thank you. I withdraw my request for a recorded vote.
Thank you. So, there being no other members to speak on the resolution, I now entertain a motion to report the resolution and recognize Mr. Good, the sponsor of H.J.Res 45.
Madam Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the resolution H.J.Res 45 to the House of Representatives, and with the recommendation that the resolution be agreed to and the resolution do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.J.Res 45 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
That's for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has requested a recorded vote. The committee will now recess and convene later in the day for a vote.
Could the clerk be more specific?
1:15. Approximately 1:15.
Because there is a photo, I think the idea is they might open it a little early so people can, if they want to vote and get themselves ready for the vote, can go. So I think that we're still working that out right now.
The committee will come to order. The unfinished business before the committee is the recorded vote on Mr. Good's motion to report the resolution. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox.
Fox votes aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Mr. Allen. Mr. Banks. Mr. Comer. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Owens. Mr. Good. Ms. McLean. Ms. Miller. Ms. Steele.
Steele votes aye.
Ms. Steele votes aye. Mr. Estes. Ms. Letlow. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Bean. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Moran. Mr. James. Ms. Chavez-Durimer. Mr. Williams. Ms. Houchin. Mr. Scott.
No, no.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Sablon. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Bonamici.
Bonamici votes no.
Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano.
Takano votes no.
Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes no.
Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross. No. Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Omar. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Ledger Fernandez. Ms. Manning.
No.
Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Bowman.
And how is Mr. Wilson recorded?
Mr. Wilson's not recorded. Mr. Wilson votes aye.
Howard Owens.
Mr. Owens is not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
How is Mr. Sablon recorded?
Mr. Sablon is not recorded. Mr. Sablon votes no.
How is Mr. Banks recorded?
Mr. Banks is not recorded. Mr. Banks votes yes.
How is Ms. Stevens recorded?
Ms. Stevens is not recorded.
Stevens is a no.
Ms. Stevens votes no.
How is Ms. Hayes recorded?
Ms. Hayes is not recorded. Ms. Hayes votes no.
How is Miss Omar voted?
Ms.
How's
Omar
Ms.
is not recorded.
recorded?
Ms. Omar votes no.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see her. How is Ms. Chavez DeRemer recorded?
Ms. Chavez Dreamer is not recorded. Ms. Chavez Dreamer votes aye.
How is Mrs. McLean recorded?
Ms. McLean is not recorded. Ms. McLean votes yes.
How is Mr. Estes recorded?
Mr. Estes is not recorded. Mr. Estes votes yes.
How's Mr. Moran recorded?
Mr. Moran is not recorded. So yes. Mr. Moran votes yes.
How's Mr. Smucker recorded?
Mr. Smucker is not recorded.
Mr. Smucker?
Mr.
Votes
Smucker
aye.
votes aye.
How's Mr. Comer recorded?
Mr. Comer is not reported. Mr. Comer votes yes.
How is Mr. Good recorded?
Mr. Good is not recorded. Mr. Good votes yes.
How is Miss Miller recorded?
Ms. Miller is not recorded.
Yes.
Ms. Miller votes yes.
How is Mr. Burleson recorded?
Mr. Burleson is not recorded. Mr. Burleson votes aye.
Wilson, after CBC, she said she was on the way.
Wilson, the only people we have left are Wilson, Leisure Fernandez.
How's Mr. James recorded?
Mr. James is not recorded.
Mr. James votes aye.
Mr. James votes aye.
How is Ms. Letlow recorded?
Ms. Letlow is not recorded. Ms. Letlow votes aye.
How's Mr. Kiley recorded?
Mr. Kiley is not recorded. Mr. Kiley votes aye.
How is Mr. Allen recorded?
Mr. Allen is not recorded. Mr. Allen votes yes.
How is Mr. Bean recorded?
Mr. Bean is not recorded.
Mr. Bean votes yes.
Mr. Bean votes yes.
How is Mr. Williams recorded?
Mr. Williams is not recorded. Yes. Mr. Williams votes yes. Oh, sorry. Just making sure. Oh, wait, no. Ms. Wild hasn't voted yet, correct? Yeah, she hasn't voted yet. No. She was here earlier. She just hasn't voted yet.
How is Ms. Wilson recorded?
Ms. Wilson is not recorded.
How is Ms. Leisure Fernandez recorded?
Ms. Leisure Fernandez is not recorded. Ms. Leisure Fernandez votes no. Ms. Wilson?
No.
Ms. Wilson votes no.
Good. You're free to go.
So is
That's
this
it.
one more?
Just a one vote.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I sent you an email.
Thank you.
Do you prefer me to send you a text? Because I sent a group email to the members, but dear,
They told us to be here by 2:15.
yeah, but then they changed it to 1:05, so that's why I sent the
Oh, they
members.
did?
Yeah,
Oh,
so I
okay.
emailed it to you. Do you want me in the future to send you a text? See, so I sent it to all the members. I said,
Oh, no, I didn't. I was in a meeting. I
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
look at it.
Okay, all right. If going forward, sometimes I'll send you a text to tell you this. Okay, great. But we good. It
Enough
was only one.
no's? Is it
Yeah.
enough no's?
Well, we just didn't, given this issue, we didn't want you to be the only person absent on this vote.
Okay, am
That's
I
all.
the only one?
No. You're good now.
Lady Moore?
You were the only, no, everybody else already voted. We were waiting for you. Yeah, because they started at 1:05. Yeah.
Ms. Houchin is not recorded. Ms. Houchin votes yes.
How is Mr. Thompson recorded?
Mr. Thompson is not recorded. Mr. Thompson votes aye.
How is Mr. Mervan recorded?
Mr. Mervan is not recorded. Mr. Mervan votes no.
The clerk will report the vote tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 24 yeas and 18 nays.
The ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. H.J.Res 45 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the resolution, and that members wishing to submit materials for the record be permitted to do so. Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Scott, for what do you seek recognition?
Madam Chair, pursuant to Committee Rule 16A2, I'm providing the committee with notice of my intention to file minority views for the inclusion as part of the printed report to accompany H.J.Res 45.
Thank you. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. The committee stands adjourned.